Hi, Catherine.
My
Hey,
apologies to everybody watching online. We did the prayer before I remembered to turn on the recording, and I'm not going to put these folks through it again, but you can find the Collect for Good Friday on the lectionary page, the lectionarypage.net, and or in your Book of Common Prayer. So today, if you were thinking to yourself after yesterday, well, I hope we're going to spend more time talking about substitutionary atonement, then today truly is a Good Friday for you, because they continue on the theme of substitutionary atonement in the last week. In fact, they call that first heading on at the beginning of chapter 6, substitutionary atonement once again. I'm just gonna ask, do you have any questions about substitution? Is that an interesting conversation for us to go into further, or are you atonemented out?
I thought it was a very interesting discussion. It makes sense to me, although I think it's by modern day Christianity, it's kind of heretical in a way to think that God did not plan this for Jesus to die for the sins of the world, but he died because of the sin of the world. I mean, it was inevitable if he was acting the way he does because of his passion for justice, that he was going to get himself killed. And I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but it's different to me than having God planned it all. You know, this was going to have to happen. Jesus had to die in order for me to forgive everybody for their sins. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I found myself inspired this morning as I was coming into work, and I posted on Facebook in reference to this, inspired in part by this, no offense to St. Anselm, but substitutionary atonement is theological horseshit. Yeah, I said it and I meant it. And you know what? I take it back. I don't care if St. Anselm it's incoherent horseshit. So I'm on the record now. Although I did that on my page and not on St. John's page, just because it's, even though it was done with emoji, it's still a little more, it actually sort of like almost crossed the line of what I was willing to put on my Facebook page at all. But I just, after reflecting more, after rereading that section last night and thinking even more about it, like the very idea that God is like, well, I would like to forgive you, but I can't unless there's a sacrifice. Like, that is bullshit. It's just like, I don't know any other way to put it. And I'm just going to come out and say it. It's a bunch of bullshit. It says a lot more about St. Anselm and about the people who hold the theory than it does about anything about God's actual self or the God as revealed by Scripture. The idea that, we have to have a legal framework, otherwise how can God forgive us? God forgives us because God loves us. Love is bigger than the strictures of a theological system that is dependent on its corollary to legal justice. Screw that. I said it.
Yay, RC.
No, I don't preach it like that today. But, it's not that I say that substitutionary atonement is a good thing in my sermon, don't worry. But yeah, so, I clearly have an opinion, and if you don't share it, you are probably now completely scared off from saying anything, having come out so strongly against substitutionary atonement. So unless anybody else wants to just agree with me, because
No, I've believed that for a long time.
Yeah, it's just sort of, I guess there's something about having, there's something about the way that the world looks this year, about being at home and being, everything being disrupted by this coronavirus, and about watching so many people dying for no reason, and and just all the grief that goes along with it. I just don't have any time for this crap anymore. I feel compelled often to be a more caring pastor and say things like, and give people the benefit of the doubt and let them sort of try and see things both ways, and I just don't have any time for that with substitutionary atonement anymore. So Mark's story of Good Friday on page 140, if you have an edition that looks like this.
I do think that because it's a composite, we so often think of the composite of the Gospels, as he points out, that it's hard to differentiate Mark from the others because we tend to bring them all together in our thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was trying to make that point yesterday. I honestly, John's passion narrative is so dominant, given the fact that it's the one that we turn to at Good Friday every year, that I am often surprised by things that I already know, like in reading Mark's gospel, Mark's passion narrative again. Like it's like, oh yeah, that is so different than what John says, and I keep having to relearn it every time I come to the text. Which is part of the reason why we read the texts and we make a point of exploring them, because I mean Mark's passion is not one of the ones that we spend. I mean, we see it once every 3 years on Palm Sunday, and that's it. And then by and large, we mostly are focused on John because we'll return to that every Good Friday.
So you were saying on 140, 141?
Yeah, I will admit I'm at a disadvantage. I have the hard copy book. I listened to this yesterday instead of reading it, and so I'm having to find things on the page that I remember, and so it's just taking me a little bit longer to get to things, and I apologize for that. I found the audiobook to be really helpful in absorbing this personally.
Well, I never did get the book, and so I'm sort of just a very poor listener. But I think getting the audiobook would be a very good advantage for me as well.
Mm-hmm.
Although I don't have it in front of me where I can mark it. I seem to, when I was having eye surgery, I listened to a lot of audiobooks.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me, so I'll probably do it that way when we get through. There's plenty of time for me to read it. I just didn't feel like it right now.
Well, he makes the point that Paul, who's the earliest author in the New Testament, uses multiple interpretations. So there is no uninterpreted account of the death of Jesus in the New Testament.
And the followers of Jesus were trying to make sense of it, exactly what happened. I mean, why did he do it, and what was the purpose? And they use later on in the chapter, they talk about, what was the term? Historic or
Reinterpretation.
Yeah, they would go back to historizing, is looking back in the Old Testament to see how it lines up with Jesus's life. And so that was interesting too.
Yeah.
I knew that they did that, but.
Well, and I mean, we have the benefit when we read the Gospels of having a narrator who's telling us where all these things happen. In John's Gospel, he said this so that it would be so that X happened, and there is all this commentary that goes along with it. And, you'd have to be really sharp to pull all these threads together in the right way as it's happening. And sharp is not a word that I would use to describe Jesus' disciples during the time when Jesus is there with them. No. They're anything but in the way that they are characterized by Jesus and the evangelists.
Well, it was an emotional situation for him. Absolutely. And I mean, from our own experience, we know that things happen and we're so emotional about it. And it's not till a little later that we understand what has happened or make sense of what's happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
find
So
the
Mark-
meaning in it.
Yeah, Mark gives us a very structured passion narrative, an account of Good Friday. You know, from dawn, or 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., 9 a.m. to noon, noon to 3 p.m., and 3 p.m. to evening, or 6 p.m. And everything falls into these categories. You know, as it, in the morning, as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole community, and they took Jesus to Pilate. And they have this conversation with Pilate. Pilate comes off as, I think, the closest in this gospel narrative to the Pilate that we see in Josephus, the Pilate that was recalled to Rome because he was horrible and was awful and brutal and calloused. You know, there, as the authors point out, there's sort of he has a snarky interaction with Jesus as he's interviewing him, as opposed to the earnest Pilate who is just, you know, woe is him because he doesn't want to have to do this thing that he's going to have to do, and how do I bear it in John's gospel. I may have been overly dramatic in that. You know, are you the king of the Jew? Are you the king of the Jews? And we should probably hear a mocking emphasis on the word Jew, of you, because of course he's already been beaten up. He looks a mess. He's there, a peasant standing before Pilate, and you know, like, this is the king of the Jews. And of course, you know, Pilate demonstrated in other areas of his life that he did not care much about Jewish people one way or the other, in the way that he put down the revolt several years after Jesus' life. And so I also like the notion that we should also probably hear in Jesus' response a mocking emphasis on the same word, you say so. The idea that Jesus would snark at the governor who has the power to crucify and kill him just raises him even further in my esteem. I got to admit, the idea that he has the gall to be able to just stand there and trade words with Pilate like that is it's delightful to me. And you know, how funny that, you know, he refuses to answer Pilate, and as our authors point out, that is a great way to make an authoritarian person really upset at you, not answering their question, which they feel entitled to have. They also point out that this is a thing. So remember the story of Barabbas. So they point out in this text that there is a puzzling episode where Pilate offers to release any prisoner the crowd wished. Puzzling because it is difficult to imagine that such a practice existed in a troublesome province like Judea. As Mark tells the story, it involves a rebel named Barabbas who had committed murder during the insurrection. Pilate asks, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews, that is Jesus? But Mark tells us the temple authorities stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. It is, I mean, this custom that he would release somebody at Passover doesn't make sense, in all fairness. And which is not to say that it didn't happen, or, you know, because, I mean, again, it shows up in all the passion narratives, which is an indicator either that it did happen or that it was so important to the text that had the narrative that had developed by the time the Gospels were written down that everyone made sure to include it.
The author makes the point that this isn't the same crowd.
Oh, definitely.
Right.
That these were people who were allowed into the palace courtyard, and I mean, they didn't let just anybody in there.
Yeah, absolutely, especially not at that hour of the day. And that's another point that I think we need to take really seriously, that you know, when we hear the whiplash between Palm Sunday, when there is a crowd that is getting all wound up about Jesus and welcoming him as the you know, king, as a king, Hosanna, Hosanna. And then 5 days later, the crowd is like, nah, crucify him. I mean, it either makes you think that that everyone at that time was incredibly fickle, which again plays into the anti-Semitism that has been perpetuated, because it's like, oh, those Jews, they don't know what they want. They're either they yell Hosanna on Sunday and crucify him on Friday. Again, that, like substitutionary atonement, is a bunch of horse emoji. What happens is they can't go into the they can't go into the temple. They can't go into the trial. And so the people who are there are people who are on the side of the temple authorities. It is the temple authorities who are yelling, crucify him, and people who are in their camp, because that's what they want. They want him crucified. And so, you know, there is a simple explanation for all this. And if you think about what's happening in the story, it makes it easier to sort of wrap your head around the whole thing. There's also this interesting thing that our authors point out about how, you know, this having been written down around the time of the destruction of the temple and the siege of Jerusalem, you know, it actually puts everything else in another light. If we set, as history remembered, the story about Barabbas is difficult, but if we set it in Mark's historical context, as he wrote around the year 70, it makes considerable sense. Both Barabbas and Jesus are revolutionaries. Both of them defied imperial authority. But Barabbas advocated violent revolution, and Jesus advocated nonviolence.
Right.
By the year 66, the Jerusalem crowd and many others in the Jewish homeland had chosen the way of Barabbas, not the way of Jesus. The events of 66 to 70 make this story intelligible. So it is understandable why there could be a crowd that would yell for Barabbas, even if it wasn't a crowd that was being whipped up by the temple authorities, because whether right or wrong, they were concerned about the continued existence of the temple and their own power as a result of it. So the first 3 hours continue to unfold. Jesus is handed over to the soldiers. He's flogged. Flogging is an important part of crucifixion because you have to exhaust the person that is going to be up on the cross. Otherwise, they will be up there for much longer than the soldiers want to stand there and watch. Because, of course, if there aren't soldiers there, then someone can come take someone down off the cross, and then they escape crucifixion, which is not what Rome wants, because Rome is trying to publicly humiliate and annihilate anybody who's being crucified. But soldiers don't particularly want to stand there for 3 days waiting for someone to get tired enough to actually die. So they whip them to within an inch of their life. Then they crucify them. And if you watch it in the Mel Gibson movie, it is horrendously graphic and gratuitously so. But that's what you pay for when you get the Mel Gibson movie. So, you know, the flogging is an important part of crucifixion and needs to be remembered. In fact, they did such an effective job of it that they would have usually made someone carry their own cross to the crossbeam to the post, as they say. They sort of describe it in the book. But there were always posts outside of town upon which people would be crucified. They, you know, in the Last Temptation of Christ, Nikos Kazantzakis makes Jesus the carpenter is someone who makes crosses for the Romans as a carpenter. Now, again, the Last Temptation of Christ is a work of fiction, and we are not suggesting that that's the kind of carpenter that Jesus actually was. But isn't it an interesting thought experiment to think about Jesus, who built crosses and then became the Jesus of the Bible as we know him? But they would have usually made someone carry their own cross, but they were so effective at whipping Jesus that he wasn't strong enough, which is why Simon of Cyrene had to be gang pressed into carrying the cross, which was a really dangerous thing, because who knows if someone is going to speak up for him once they get to Golgotha. He's the one carrying a cross. And so, you know, who says he's not going to get crucified too? You know, it's really bad news to end up carrying somebody else's cross like that. And so, you know, we need to be panicked on Simon's behalf when he gets gang pressed into assisting.
Speaking of carrying the cross is something that I learned from this book, is that they didn't really carry the whole cross. They just carried the the part that went over the vertical pole that was stationary on the mountain.
Mhm.
So it was still heavy, and he was still weak and needed help, but it's not the actual cross. I always had in my mind carrying an actual cross.
No, because I mean,
Mark
again,
points that
the
out.
cross has to be strong enough to support a human person on it, and so they had to dig really deep in order to set the crosses, the vertical pole, in order to set them, and so they'd stayed still, and so they were permanently installed on Golgotha outside of the city gates, and then you just carry your own crossbeam out. It was very efficient. It sort of reminds one of Germany in World War II, and the sort of cruel efficiency that they came up with in extermination of humans. This is not going to be a super cheerful not going to be a super cheerful day. There's a whole lot of horrible things happening in the text here, in the story here. At 9 a.m., they crucify Jesus, and interesting that Mark, as they say, Mark refers to the event only with a short phrase, and they crucified him. Chapter 15, verse 24. As they point out, when Mark was writing all this, he did not need to tell people any more about crucifixion, because it was all still within living memory. They knew about the flogging, they knew about the parades, they probably had seen it happen whoever encountered this story, if they were in Rome or part of the Roman Empire, they'd seen all this happening. And so it was just, it is what it is. And they yep, and they crucified him. It'd be sort of like us, and she got in her car and drove. And that might deserve a few extra sentences of description if you didn't know what a car was and didn't know what driving was. So we are sort of at a loss and need that extra context when we encounter the story ourselves. It's in this section that they make the point that crucifixion was a form of Roman imperial terrorism. First and above all, although Romans did not invent it, they reserved it for very special victims. You only got crucified for sedition and for undermining the authority of Rome. And that basically meant attacking Rome like Jesus did non-violently, like Barabbas did violently, or encouraging slave uprisings, because slavery was important for the way that Rome worked. I apologize if I'm boring you in mentioning this, but there are references in, and I think I've already mentioned this week, but there are references of a slave uprising in Rome. A slave killed their master, and there was consternation among Roman senators about, well, I mean, does that mean we have to kill all 400 of his slaves? Because that was the law. If one slave killed their master, all the slaves were killed they were all crucified as punishment, which was in order to get slaves to prevent each other from killing their master. And it included women and children. I mean, the references said, but there are 400, including women and children, among this, and the record seems to be that they just crucified them all, because that's what you did. And it's horrifying. But it is, I mean, it really is, the purpose of crucifixion is the annihilation of the individual. As they point out, not only are people, if they're left on the cross, not only are they subject to being carrion for birds, but they often would crucify them low enough that you could also be, you also had to worry about dogs and animals on the ground. It's all grim. It's all grim stuff to be talking about, but that's what Good Friday is. Because if we don't, I mean, there's a part of me that's really concerned that if we aren't upfront about all this, if we aren't upfront about the reality of what crucifixion is, it's very easy to end up with a patina over it and to sort of spare ourselves from understanding what's really at play here. That this is really an example of the brutality of Rome coming to bear on Jesus, who never did anything wrong, and it's easy to sort of wear rose-colored glasses about the whole thing. But I think on Good Friday itself, it's important to remember just how horrendous it was, and how even and to remember that even in the midst of it being a horrendous thing, it's not strong enough to defeat Jesus. That Christ's light still is not extinguished by crucifixion and death. That, you know, there is hope at the end of this story, and that is the hope that which has gathered Christians for millennia, us included. Even this year, when we're all stuck inside and, you know, frightened of this coronavirus, there is still hope. We know how this story ends. We're not experiencing it for the first time. We're just remembering how extreme it was, because that helps us to reframe what happens on Sunday more effectively. So, as many of you will recall, the soldiers cast lots for his clothing. It's like throwing dice. There's, you know, everyone has their token, and the one that comes up wins. They didn't want to cut his tunic because it was woven in one piece from the top. That detail persists in more than one gospel, although I don't know that they talked about it, but, you know, that detail persists among a number of the gospels, and so it's likely to be true. But, you know, even if it's not, you know, it's still part of the story. On the cross was the inscription, "The King of the Jews." Again, this is sarcastic Pilate. He's trying to make a point to all Jewish people about what he will do to your king, to even your king, if you don't follow the party line.
It's, to me, also important to remember that the followers did not have the benefit of the resurrection as they witnessed all of this happening. And of course it was excruciating for them and devastating for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, they had been told that reality wasn't there yet.
And even if they had been told, they wouldn't have understood it. Again, these are not, they do not come out looking great in any of the Gospels. They don't really come into their own until the Acts of the Apostles. It is interesting, you know, the point that they make about the two bandits that are being crucified with Jesus also being insurrectionists and freedom fighters, depending on how you want to look at it, is another interesting point. I mean, the English word bandits gets, you know, it gets tossed around a lot, and part of the problem is that if crucifixion is something that can happen to just bandits, and it's a regular old punishment for all kinds of things, then you lose the perspective that you have on why it was that Jesus was crucified and what Rome was trying to accomplish, and it lessens to a certain extent the importance of Jesus's political message, or it makes it possible to sanitize Jesus of any political message. And, you know, that doesn't do Jesus any favors, because Jesus is inherently political by his very nature. So, you know, making sure that Dismas and Rasmus, as they came to be known apocryphally, and the two bandits, you know, in John's gospel, you know, or in other gospels, they get a far better viewing. You know, one of them, "Surely I tell you, you'll be, you know, at the end of the day, you'll be with me in paradise." That's not what happens in Mark's gospel. They are participating fully in all the snark, and they're just as awful as everybody else has been, despite being crucified along with him. Like, I don't know, I guess.
Well, the author makes the point that Jesus' way is nonviolent and their way is violence.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think it takes a whole lot of, I mean, that's a bold move, being like, I mean, I realize I've also been crucified and I will also be dead by the end of the day, but like, you're the ridiculous one, you know, while crucified. That's a big swing from the bandits. You know, that's a heck of a thing. From noon to 3, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. I love the fact that the authors go into they debunk this notion like, well, it must have been an eclipse. Well, you know what? Astronomers, like the motions of the skies and the way the moon travels around the earth and everything, that's all regular. So astronomers can figure out if there was an eclipse, and there wasn't. There was no eclipse anytime near then that would have had anything to do with them. And as they point out, eclipses last for a couple minutes, like 4 at the most. I remember when, was it 2 years ago, we had the big eclipse that sort of burned its way across the entire U.S., you know, in a big swath. I was in Minnesota on vacation the day that happened, and so we took a road trip down to Nebraska to see friends and to you know, be in the totality of the eclipse, because that sounded kind of awesome. And yeah, the totality was about 3 or 4 minutes, and it was amazing and miraculous, and then it was over. And you know, there was no like, for an hour ahead of time, oh, it's getting a little bit darker, and like, no, it was the whole show was 5 minutes long, and then it was over, and then we move on, and then it's like, oh, well, this doesn't look any different than anything else. I just really enjoy it when stuff like that gets debunked. And I'm not the sort of person that knows how to do the kind of math that it would take to figure out if there had been an eclipse that year. And I admire people who can do that, and just knowing. So it sure seems like they're speaking metaphorically about the darkness that came over the land, or that they're using it as that Mark is using it as an image.
Well, throughout the Bible, they talk about darkness as being a symbol of mourning or God's displeasure or something. It's all symbolic throughout the Bible. So
absolutely. And then at 3 o'clock, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then which is, as they point out, that was the last time that he had spoken in this narrative since he had spoken to Pilate and said, well, you say that I'm a king. He doesn't say anything else for the whole rest of the time. As opposed to in John's gospel, where Jesus is a comparative chatterbox next to in Mark's gospel. It's also, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Again, how would anybody know? Because nobody was allowed to go into the temple except for on Yom Kippur, and even then it was only the high priest. It must have, But it's interesting that in Mark's gospel, there were women looking on from a distance as opposed to being nearby. And Jesus was, it looks like, much more alone in crucifixion in Mark's gospel than he is in the others. And as Jesus is on the cross, he says to John, or the disciple whom he loved, which people are pretty much of a mind that it's John the evangelist referring to himself, says to Mary, behold your son, behold your mother. There's conversation that's happening with Jesus while he's crucified, and this is not the case in Mark's gospel.
Could I interject here? Going back to the temple rent in 2, that was something I never understood what that was all about. And the way the author put it was very meaningful to me, that the tearing of that temple curtain meant that there was now access to God.
Yes.
Apart from the temple domination system that didn't allow anybody but one time a year the chief priest could go in there. But this is what Christ came to abolish, this domination system. And it's very meaningful that at that time of his death that happened. And I went, but I guess it's not in John's gospel, it's in Luke and Matthew. But it is, I never understood why they even said that. But it is now interestingly, and it's a good point.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? They go on in John's gospel. John goes up immediately to saying how he really knows what what the deal was. He who saw this has testified, so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. That's a funny sentence to end up in John's gospel. So yeah, so that's, thank you, Jim. That's you made the point perfectly on their behalf. And in Mark, as in others of the synoptic gospels, we find that someone there says, as soon as Jesus dies, someone who is there watching says, "Oh, geez, that really was the Son of God," expressing buyer's remorse. Well, we got what we wanted, and now, uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Yeah.
There are women, as they say, there are more witnesses to Jesus' death from afar, but close enough to see his women followers watch. From what is said about Mary Magdalene in other Gospels, she was the most important of Jesus' female followers. About the other Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, we know nothing. About the third woman, we can say only that Salome was a common woman's name in the first century. We don't know a whole lot. All we really know is that they were there and the men weren't, and that says something about women and men, and what's important. It also, I think, may say something about what the risk was for being there for the women and for the men, but I'm not sure. Fawn.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, all my life I believed that his mother was there, but it's not this Mary.
Mark does not say that. I don't believe that Mark says that Mary, Jesus' mother, was there. Matthew does.
Oh, okay.
And because we read that on Palm Sunday. John does, because there's that whole conversation. I wonder about Luke.
Well, it's good to know that I'm not, totally wrong.
No, you're not at all.
Yeah, okay, good. Oh, damn. Sorry, phone call.
Verse 40, 1540, and Mark says there were also women looking on from afar.
Yeah.
Among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. So it doesn't say the mother of Jesus, does it? Yeah.
Thank you. You've answered my question.
Yeah, I'm skimming through Luke's gospel account, Luke's Passion account right now, just to see if Luke is where Jesus turns and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Among them were women who were, a great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. It does not say at this point, however, but all of his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. That's what we say. That's what we hear.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are named in Luke.
But in John they are.
In John, yes, and in Matthew.
And in Matthew, right. Matthew, Mark, and John. They're listed. Almost exactly.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you.
In the time, it was considered kind of a non-event.
Another Friday. In fact, it was not only just another Friday, but they were trying to get this squeezed in before they
Sabbath began.
before the Sabbath of Great Solemnity started, because they wanted to get stuff done so they could get to partying, as it were, to being observant, is a more charitable way to put that to them.
In John 19:27, then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." We don't know who that is, do we?
Well, no. What they believe is that the theory, which is grounded in, which is not really, it's pretty widely held, is that it's John speaking about himself. He refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So it's John the evangelist, and then in Matthew's gospel, many women were also there looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and
Mother of the sons of Zebedee.
the mother of the sons of Zebedee. I thought that
Who's saying, in John it says, "Behold your mother." Who would be saying that?
it's
You know?
Jesus is saying that to John the evangelist of Mary.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It's like his mom, Jesus's mom, is there near the cross, and it's sort of like Jesus saying, "Please take care of her now that I'm not going to be able to do it."
Got it. Okay.
Ensuring that in her widowhood that she's not abandoned and left to die.
It says, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Dear woman, here's your son," and to this disciple, "Here's your mother." And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home.
What verse is that, Judy?
Pardon me?
What verse was that you were reading from?
25,
Which gospel?
John.
No, okay. Just thought I'd go find it. Yeah, okay. It's right there.
So and then when evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw where the body was laid. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, even if she's not mentioned by Mark directly at the cross, she is mentioned directly by Mark at the tomb. Which is understandable.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So there's another question of Jesus' death as a sacrifice. The bottom of page 153 starts that next section. The discussion of ransom and lutron. The Greek word translated as ransom, lutron, is used in the Bible not in the context of payment for sin, but to refer for payment made to liberate captives or slaves. A lutron is a means of liberation from bondage. Thus, to say that Jesus gave his life a ransom for many means that he gave his life as a means of liberation from bondage. The context of the passage in Mark supports this reading. The preceding verses are a critique of the domination system. The rulers of the nations lord it over their subjects, and their great ones are tyrants. In contrast to the rulers of this world, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a lutron, a means of liberation for many. Mark does not understand the death of Jesus as a substitutionary sacrifice for sin. Claims to the contrary can only point to a mistaken reading of the single passage that we've just explored. So how does Mark understand Jesus' death? As an execution by authorities because of his challenge to the domination system. The decision of the temple authorities to take action against him was made after his disruptive act at the temple. These local collaborators handed him over to imperial authority, which then crucified him on a charge that was simultaneously and indissolubly political and religious, King of the Jews. As such, Mark understands Jesus' death as a judgment on the authorities and the temple. Mm-hmm. There's then a conversation about how Mark uses the Jewish Bible as, and how quotes the Jewish Bible, describing how it shapes his interpretive frame and uses it to support his arguments about who Jesus is.
Well, like all of us, he comes into this situation with his own ideas, because he was brought up as a Jew, and so he has to fit it into that story.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean Mark or do you mean Jesus?
Mark.
Mark.
Yeah, just being clear, because I mean, there is also an extent to which Jesus also uses the Jewish Bible in his ministry, and I just want to make sure I understood who you meant.
They're Jews.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 7 minutes left.
And a lot of book.
Yeah. So the next section is, we've got about 5 pages to go after the section on
the Jewish Bible.
Jewish Bible, divine necessity or human inevitability. Ooh. Did Jesus' death have to happen? There are 2 quite different reasons one might think so. One is divine necessity, the other is human inevitability. I think divine necessity is an interesting question. It goes along to the atonement that we've talked about so thoroughly.
Well, the authors say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, on page 161.
God bless you.
Clearly, it is never the will of God that a righteous man be crucified. Did it have to happen? It might have turned out differently. Judas might not have betrayed Jesus. The temple authorities might have decided on a course of actions other than recommending execution. Pilate might have let Jesus go or decided on a punishment other than death. But this didn't happen. And like the storyteller of Genesis, early Christian storytellers looking back on what did happen ascribe providential meanings to Good Friday. But that does not mean Good Friday had to happen. But human inevitability, but for another reason, the execution of Jesus was virtually inevitable. Not because of divine necessity, but because of human inevitability. This is what domination systems did to people who publicly and vigorously challenged them. Jesus is not simply an unfortunate victim of a domination system's brutality. He was also a protagonist filled with passion. His message was about the kingdom of God. He spoke to peasants as a voice of peasant religious protest against the central economic and political institutions of his day. It's his passion that got him killed. And as we've said, the differences between the haves and the have-nots were evident in Jerusalem, to be sure, but they were even more pronounced between the elite in Jerusalem and the people of Galilee, where they were, so far removed and so much poorer than the people in Judea and in the areas surrounding Jerusalem. And Jesus would have seen that clearly growing up. People having to make the 100-mile trip down to Jerusalem and having to pay the temple tax and being crushed by the double taxation that they were subject to, especially within living memory of Jesus. Jesus' parents lived in entirely in a time of Herod the Great, who was so ruthless in the way that he built extravagant things for himself and extorted incredible money out of his people in order to accomplish it. The things had just gotten so bad by Jesus' time that he couldn't help but be passionate about the people who are downtrodden, the people who are being ground up by the gears of the empire, and wanted to do something about it.
I love the way he did tie that together. I always think of the Passion of Christ on Good Friday, of just what it was, the passion and death. But now, after reading this, I'm more into knowing how passionate Christ was about justice, which led to his passion and death.
Yeah, I think the really important sentence at the toward the end of the chapter is that Jesus didn't die for the sins of the world, but he did die because of the sin of the world. And that doesn't, I don't think, diminish it any. I think that shift in the understanding of the atoning, the salvific event of Christ's death, to use the fancy seminary terms that I paid way too much money to acquire, would they sort of it doesn't cheapen it any. It doesn't make it any less important or any less sacred. It simply helps us to realize that there was a different focus that's being advanced not only by the biblical text but by the work that Jesus was doing. But it's not simply that this is another way to look at it. It's that this is what is pretty clearly being advanced by the Gospels themselves. And if we don't look hard enough, we won't see it. Judy, you were trying to say something.
Well, I think in our own time, I'm reminded of Oscar Romero, because that wasn't divinely, his sacrifice wasn't divinely, but it was a result of the domination system and his talking against it and preaching against it. So he was bound to be shot, bound to be killed.
Well, it totally reminds, am I on?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, good. It totally reminds me about unions. I mean, here we are trying to, like, Jesus was the original organizer. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well put.
Against the domination system. Yes.
Exactly. And, I never realized all this. I love this book.
I do too.
I do too.
Well, that's just music to my ears. I'm so delighted that this has been fruitful for you so far.
Fantastic.
It's a great book.
Wow.
I agree.
Long felt this way, and people really resent it. At any rate, I think that might carry this book with me wherever I go.
Can't hear you.
Oh, I'm having a lot of trouble with it. That I'm often criticized because I'm always saying that my politics is part of my religion. I can't separate them.
No.
So true.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Injustice.
And people who try to separate them are usually trying to do are doing it intentionally because their politics don't agree.
Yes.
Right.
And it's so evident to the rest of us. What's wrong with them? Sorry.
It's pretty clear to me that Jesus would not be on the side of gathering a whole bunch of people together right now and running the risk of a bunch of them dying from the coronavirus, although there are those pastors who insist on doing so for mostly, it looks to me, mostly because of their own arrogance.
And passing the plate.
Yeah.
And lack of trust.
They could get their coffers
I think
filled more.
I think it's lack of trust in God.
Indeed. Oh, or misplaced trust.
Well, maybe, yeah.
God will keep me safe.
Mhm.
All about them. It isn't about anyone else. It's just about,
Yeah.
and it's greed. A lot of it is greed, in my
Good.
opinion.
When I supported Obama, there were those in my former church that told me I should confession and confess that I was an Obama supporter. And there are also those that was elected by God's will. I'm just going, okay.
Well, I think God is an Obama supporter. I think God is also a Donald Trump supporter. I think God is on the side of the people that are in power and does everything possible to help them to rule with justice and mercy. I think in some cases God is less successful in getting through to those individuals for whatever reason. And I will leave it to your imaginations to figure out of whom I speak. It's
Not hard to imagine.
It's
The
10:02.
The Antichrist.
My
Thank you all for
prayers haven't been answered.
Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us today. We will be together again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. And if you show up at our website at 8:30 beforehand, you'll be able to pray the liturgy of Holy Saturday before we start. And
Awesome.
so I'll see you at one or the other, or hopefully both.
Okay.
Tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Be safe.